My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And guess what? I've got a fever swamp, and the only prescription is more hex crawl.
Fever Swamp is a 32-page hex crawl sandbox adventure compatible with Lamentations of the Flame Princess and most other Dungeons & Dragons clones. It was written by Luke Gearing and features art by Andrew Walter and is published by the Melsonian Arts Council. The book begins with a couple of handy quick reference pages, which include the map with page numbers and the random encounter tables. The text proper starts with some general information about the Fever Swamp, a table of rumors, and the encounter tables once more. From there, we get some information about the people of Fever Swamp, as well as a really handy table of tribe characteristics.
Next comes the hex map and descriptions of its 14 locations, and this makes up the bulk of the book. There is the village of Clink, the Corpse Ruins, that's a mini dungeon/tomb, carved from the bones of an ancient titanic beast and itself divided into 8 further key locations. Back on the main hex map, there's the Tree Spider Trap, the Explosive Madman, Grandfather Rot, a godling living in the swamp, the Shipwreck of the Wasserkönig, the Mushroom Spirit Houses, the Scumboggle Hive, Hunger, the Crocodile, a Suicidal Swamp Witch, an Oracular Succubus, and then 3 ruins, a failed settlement, a fallen monastery, and the destroyed tower. Following that are then 3 appendices. Appendix A includes 2 PC classes, the Transfiguration Host and the Shaman. Appendix B is for Bestiary, and it includes the special monsters and creatures of the Fever Swamp. And finally, Appendix C includes special rules for doing a swamp crawl, including rules for sinking boats and all manner of diseases.
Fantastic. Let's talk about our experience with the module. Tom, what about yours?
Well, knowing we were going to talk about this, I threw together a very quick, 2 and a bit hour one-shot using the Stay Frosty rule set. So that meant porting it over to a kind of colonial marines from Aliens setting and having a bunch of guys in an armoured hovercraft going about the place, but still, I think, pretty similar in its outcomes and tone.
Yeah, I was actually a player in Fever Swamp. I haven't run it, but I have been a player in a long one-shot at Camp Nerdly, which was run by longtime Gauntleteer Dylan Ross. Oh, I should mention, fun fact, Dylan Ross is the very first Patreon supporter of the Gauntlet. So really? He holds that distinction. And he ran me through Fever Swamp. It was a lot of fun. Let's talk about things we liked about this book. Tom, why don't you start?
Okay, well, I think the main thing to say about it is it's a really nicely stocked, well put together, manageable sandbox setting. It's got a great selection in the key hexes, the 14 things that I ran through in that list just now. It's got a bigger settlement, that's the village of Clink, so that's somewhere you could go and actually talk to people, find out about the area. It's got a mini dungeon in it, which is always useful in this kind of thing. Things to fight, things to investigate, just enough things that are labeled ruins to be confusing when you're trying to hunt down a specific one. Just a really good setup. So there's plenty of different things to do, and there's always something that can kick you on to want to explore a different location, which I thought was pretty good as well.
Yeah, I happen to agree. I thought the mix of elements of this module were really good. Like you said, there's a nice mix of social locations and a little dungeon and all the and like individual sort of cabined off encounters. You know, I played in a one shot of it and we saw a fair amount of Fever Swamp. Like I didn't know about Fever Swamp until I played it. And then when I was reading the text in preparation for this, I was like, oh, we did a lot of this stuff. And yet I could also see it being very satisfying in say 4 to 6 sessions, like a little mini campaign. So I think you could do like a really satisfying one shot or a really satisfying short series out of Fever Swamp. And for its slim, it's 32 pages or something?
Yeah, 32 pages. Yeah.
Probably only 29 pages of text or something like that. It's pretty versatile, very handy. What else did you like about it, Tom?
Well, I'd also like to highlight something that I think we'd normally stick into the Chain Lightning round, but actually it's probably deserving of more discussion, and that's the diseases table, which is just 1 page at the back of the book, But I think it's doing a lot of work in pitching the kind of it's sort of blackly comic, some of its sentries. It's got rules for things like being taken over by a weird magic worm, but also for diarrhea, and I think there's malaria's in there. I don't know what else. I forget off the top of my head. But all of the entries are a little bit funny, but also you look at the actual rules effects and you think, oh, that's awful, which I think is a great way to do it. It's sort of, because obviously trying to evoke a swamp setting, you're going to want to have this as a possibility, and for it to be in the back of people's minds. But it's like, I've never really seen a set of disease rules in role-playing games that seem in any way fun or interesting to deal with. But this is kind of an exception.
I will throw in for blood in the chocolate, but okay. No, I happen to agree. I think the disease tables was great. And as a player, when we were getting hit with the diseases, it did seem a little funny because we had one of our players in the group get hit with this like really aggressive diarrhea. Like it was like really aggressive. Like, and I was like, oh my goodness. And that player actually was not having a good time with it. But I think that player was also like, I don't know, like you could tell they kind of weren't there for any of it. Actually, I don't think it was anything to do with like how the situation was presented. The rest of us thought it was amusing. And when I went back and looked, I was like, oh, that's how it was supposed to go.
Yeah.
It was kind of funny and kind of aggressive, but it really helped set the tone, I thought, like, because suddenly the danger wasn't just, the weird green men swimming in the swamp or whatever. It was, it was the environment, right? It was like something quote unquote natural, right? That you had to cope with. And, I thought it was a good touch. I agree. That table was really good. What else did you like about it?
I'm also just quite into the writing style, which is that great mix of brevity and connotation that marks out a well put together kind of keyed, dungeon entries or hex crawl entries in this case. So like it'll sort of have a prosaic, quick description so you know what you're talking about. And then very often these little details that will either add something memorable to the encounter, but also give something for players to hook onto. So an example I picked out from Appendix B, the leech chewer. It has a note that it can be distracted, and I'm quoting here, with a haunch of meat tossed into the trees. And that's just the kind of tip that, if you talk to the locals, they go, oh yeah, watch out for that thing, but just chuck some meat into the trees. And of course, if you've alienated the locals, they won't tell you that until you get back. And then they'll be like, right, yeah. Why didn't you just throw some meat after your party's half dead? And, when you read through it, all of these little things add up to something you can see a whole bunch of different stories. You could see, oh, this might happen and this might happen. They might chase after this. But there's no actual one story that is the goal for you to play through. And of course, that's kind of the ideal for any OSR module, I think, is that a wealth of possibility without forcing you to do it in one particular way to get the most out of it.
Awesome. For me, apart from just the really good mix of content in its 32 pages, I thought the book had a really high degree of usability from both an organization and presentation standpoint. I think the map and the tables being right at the front of the PDF is so damn handy. As someone who almost exclusively uses PDFs, that's the kind of thing you don't want to look for, right? You don't want to be scrolling in the middle of a PDF to try to find that, right? It's nice to have it right up front. Like those two things you're going to be using, especially the map most frequently. It's nice to have right up front. So that was really handy. A lot of the entries have little checkboxes so that you can keep track of the number of monsters in an encounter, how many are left, that kind of thing. Very, very handy feature. I wish more modules had something like that. And just the overall sort of compact design, I thought would make it a real easy thing to just print the whole thing up and mark it up as needed, right? Definitely.
And actually, I hadn't really thought about it until you just said it now about the map being at the front. And of course, what that is kind of an ingenious solution to the issue of PDF bookmarking in that it's easy to hop to somewhere, but you can hop back in Adobe Reader or whatever, but it's not as easy. Whereas with the hex map here, you click on the hex or the entry, you jump to there, and then you just go back to the first page. You don't need to think about navigating back to where you came from. Oh, also, top tip in the PDF for online GMs, which I did not notice until after we'd finished playing. Those checkboxes, you can click on them and they get little X's in them on the PDF.
Oh, very good. Very good. Listeners, if you are putting together an OSR thing and you ever hope for it to be covered on Fear of a Black Dragon, include internal PDF bookmarking and other nifty things. Yeah. You will get Tom's eternal gratitude. Some other things I enjoyed about Fever Swamp. I think the bestiary is very nice. I actually run quite a number of swamp-based adventures. It's a setting I like or an environment I like, I should say. And, you get tired of giant crocodiles and lizard men, right? You want something different. So I thought the bestiary added like a nice mix of new monsters. And there's a good range of difficulties there, from like sort of common animals to weird creatures to very powerful entities. So I like that. And then I also thought that the Corpse dungeon was really fun. It adds this really interesting layer of like mystery and history to the proceedings that I think the book needs, right? Like because the book is otherwise very concerned with sort of like the natural environment and the people of Clink, and this sort of very present day like concern of this like cult and whatever this cult is up to. But the Corpse ruins adds this like level of weirdness and mystery and like and this sense of like this place has been here forever, right? And I really love that. So let's talk about questions we had. I have one. I'll just do mine real quick and then we'll do yours, Tom.
Yep.
So what's with all these common ass names?
Yeah.
I don't want to have encounters with people named Jason, Daniel, and Jasmine in my cult-infused fantasy swamp adventure.
No, I'm inclined to agree. When my PCs met Jasmine, I sort of reflexively had someone refer to her as Lady Jasmine, just because. And then and it actually sort of became a gag when they met Daniel, who's like I think he's the big bulky guy in the market in Clink, and so he'd had this sort of quite colourful description, and then I had to say his name quite prosaically is Daniel. It seems weirdly anticlimactic after everything else that's going on. So I don't know what is up with that. Maybe it's a setting thing.
Well, the way you just sold Daniel just now makes me think it might be a good idea. But yeah, I don't know. It might be a setting thing. I'm not sure. But I was like, huh, what? I don't play role-playing games, so I can play characters named Jason. Sorry. What about your questions, Tom?
Okay. Mine are just sort of more nitpicky and plot-based. I guess one thing is the Corpse. What happens if you pull the lever in the lowest chamber there? Because that happened in our game, and I think what happens is it slightly increases the amount of zombies roaming the swamp, but I wasn't entirely clear on that. I feel almost certain I missed a reference somewhere in that section, but I couldn't find it quickly enough at the time. I
went back and looked at it after you put this question in our notes, and I couldn't quite make it out either. So listeners have the right context here. There's this one chamber that's like filled with like searing light or something like that, mm-hmm. right? And this light suppresses to some degree the power of this being that's the sort of like final boss thing of the dungeon called the Corpse. And the Corpse is super interesting, actually. Like this idea of this corpse that was never alive. Like that's a cool concept, right? And so if you flip this lever, the searing light recedes, I believe.
Yeah, it turns the light off, I think, which presumably means more of the black radiation comes out.
Right. The power of the Corpse, more of it comes out, which then does
something.
Right. Yeah. It was not super clear. Maybe the authors will clear that up for us. But.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, to be fair, it is quite clear on what happens in a number of other circumstances. But if you only turn off the lever and don't do anything else, that was what I wasn't too sure about. But yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Pretty minor. Also, those two PC classes, the Transfiguration host is one where to précis that there's a worm that can get into your system either deliberately in some of the cultures in the Fever Swamp or accidentally as you're just blundering around like an idiot in a canoe. And what can then happen is you start to gain weird powers, eventually grow bat wings or something, sometimes depending on what happens when you hit level 7. And one of the things that can happen is the Fever Swamp calls to you and you're just drawn back to it. And I don't know, is that good? Would you use that in your game, Jason? What do you reckon about that?
I think it would depend on... There are a lot of variables there, right?
Yeah.
For me, it would depend on, is this more than just a short campaign? If this is a longer campaign, I think that's a consideration. If it is a longer campaign, will introducing this element be too disruptive? I'm inclined to say that it's pretty cool. I like it. I like stuff like that. Like I'm a fan of game elements that are kind of push your luck, right? Or that sort of have a corruption element, right? Or you gain power, in exchange for hindering your character in some way. I'm a fan of that generally. So I think I'm into it.
Yeah, I think I'm okay. I just probably want the player who it happens or potentially happens to be aware of what's down the road. So maybe I'd just try and make sure of having a few, random local old guys warn them about the transfiguration worm and stuff,
Yeah. Or honestly, like, I would just have that conversation,
or just
out
of
character too. Yeah. Like, that wouldn't bug me.
I mean, I might have it out of character, but in the voice of a weird old man from the swamp. That could be the best of both worlds. Anyway, so yeah. And then my third question was just, could you tell us a bit more about your Camp Nerdly game? Like, what kind of system was it in? What kind of characters did you have exploring the swamp? That kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. We were doing the Black Hack. Hey, pro tip for the Black Hack. You can just win every combat by having a wizard with sleep spell. So there you go. And I hope they fix that in the upcoming Black Hack 2E. I'm being a little facetious, but that was basically how every combat ended. It was good. So we played the Black Hack. We had something like 5 characters. It was a pretty big table. I was playing a thief because whenever I'm a player in fantasy games, I always play a thief. Like, always. Like, that's just what I play. That's it. And we had a wizard with sleep. We had like a warrior guy. We had, interesting. We had a player who insisted on being a salamander, but like a literal salamander, not like the D&D monster salamander. Mm-hmm. And so that was strange, like having a tiny salamander.
Was he just a normal salamander, like couldn't speak or anything as well? Because I mean, it's a great role-playing challenge, but it was
a cleric salamander, so it could speak and it could do magic, but it was a small, tiny salamander. It was a bit weird. It was it was the middle of the afternoon before dinner, and I think nobody was in the mood to to argue about it. So that's kind of where we went with that.
I'm kind of into it just from that description, but I don't know. Yeah, I'd have to be there, I suppose.
Well, and that character is the one that got struck with the rampant, ravaging diarrhea, and so just have this weird, occasional moment of this salamander doing little salamander poops,
on someone's shoulder or something. Interesting.
Yeah, so anyway, but no, it was a good game. There was nothing about the stuff going on in the module that felt like it had to be run in a particular system. It worked great in Black Hack. So
cool.
All right, chain lightning round. Kick us off, Tom.
All right, so the other PC class that we haven't mentioned yet is the Shaman. I haven't tried it out, but I like the way that the means of advancing involves taming or befriending a new and different kind of spirit each time. It feels kind of right. It doesn't have direct real-world analogs in that spirits list, but you can kind of see real-world shamanisms from there. And yeah, I think it really captures just the right kind of wild and totemic. Well, I was going to use the word spirit again, which is probably not ideal, but yeah, there you go. That kind of sentiment.
I really enjoy the tribe characteristics table. I think it was Kalong, maybe Yunsun, I can't remember, but it had something similar, and I loved it there too. It's a table of basically tribal characteristics. You roll on the table to see if this particular group of people, you get one little sort of detail about their culture. And I really, really like that. I have a couple of good ones here on my notes from the table. The first is that all of the members of the tribe bear open wounds, deliberately inflicted and left to fester in the swamp's humid air. Just kind of a gruesome little detail. Yeah. And another is all appear to be heavy with child. They carry parasites within their bellies knowingly.
I also liked the entry on the scumboggles, weird little green people that live in the swamp, and the line in particular, the only thing they love more than man flesh is cheese.
I liked Grandfather Rot. That is spelled R-O-T-T-E, and I believe it's pronounced Rot. Grandfather Rot is this godling that lives in the swamp that you can encounter and I suppose do battle with if you wish, if you're that kind of party. And it's just I just like the idea of this just godling, just kind of living there amidst all this other stuff. I like elements like that give a fantasy setting a certain gravity.
And I also liked from Appendix B there, these stilt walkers, these kind of creepy, long-legged, as the name suggests, monsters that aren't described in too much detail, but make me think of the sort of spooky things that you'd find in the woodlands, in the Moomins, and also, of course, remind me of the stilt-walking people in the fens in East Anglia, like in Hereward the Wake and stuff like that, just stalking across the landscape. And they're particularly scary in Fever Swamp because they like to put holes in your boat, which is a bad thing.
And finally, I'm going to say the Candle Thieves. These are spirits of lost children that are desperate for a light to lead them home. I just like that they kind of, they're these little spirits that steal your lanterns and candles and things. So good detail. let's go on to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. Tom, what are we talking about today?
Well, I thought it would be interesting to talk about swamps, and specifically to do that because, it's easy to fall into a trap of getting like really abstract and didactic, how can I do X or Y? But I thought, let's just talk about what's interesting about running games set in swamps, how to make swamps fun. And then you, dear listener, being an intelligent and creative sort, will be able to extrapolate from that to hopefully use it as an example, maybe a template for running stuff in Arctic wastelands or what have you. So, the first thing I was thinking about was I don't particularly have much experience with swamps. Like, I live in a slightly swampy area, but not particularly, like it's subtropical. But then I thought, well, that probably doesn't stop me from using elements of things I've experienced in my own life, whether as a GM or a player, to talk about how things feel or how my character is feeling as you pass through the environment. So, like, I was thinking, how would I do that? I just sort of break down a swamp is hot, it's humid, it kind of smells of brackish water all the time, which, given the drainage in our apartment block, is pretty easy to imagine. There's constant sort of noise of insects and birds in the background, I think. And so, it's easy to imagine being in a hot room and sweating a lot. But then I thought of an example from when I first moved to Hong Kong. I was living on an island called Lama, which is slightly swampier than many others in Hong Kong. And I couldn't sleep for quite a long time because my flat was out near a small river that ran past a little field. And late at night, I would just keep hearing this noise over and over again that was sort of, I couldn't decide if it sounded like it could be, at one point I thought maybe it's just a metal fence, like a gate swinging back and forth that hasn't been oiled, because it was making a sort of noise. And I thought, no, it's too, sort of happens too often for that, and it's not windy enough, right? Then, is it some kind of animal? But it wasn't an animal I recognized. It wasn't, like, it could be a goose, but there are no geese on the island. That doesn't make sense either. And then I was like, is it someone just deliberately playing the cello really badly in a kind of avant-garde way? It's like, that seems psychotic, but there are some weirdos.
If I had $1.
Yeah. And, but eventually I just mentioned it to someone, in the shop, and they went, oh, that's toads. That's what that's toad noises. And once I had been told that, I was able to immediately know, oh, okay, it's toads. And I was able to get to sleep okay, because finally I wasn't trying to figure out what the hell it was. And it occurred to me that's just I think if you meet someone in the village of Clink in Fever Swamp and you need to get them to tell someone an anecdote, it's not a great story, but it's just a weird little thing that happens when you're in an unfamiliar environment. You hear sounds that you just cannot quite put your finger on. So that is one thing I would have picked out and maybe used just on if I had a player character in Fever Swamp, I would maybe have that happen to them. I don't know. What do you think about that kind of thing? What's a swampy element in your life, Jason?
Well, apart from my job, you mean?
Yeah.
No. I think what you said there is really interesting. I do run lots of swamp-based adventures, like I said earlier in the episode. And I like to focus on the discomfort that the player characters feel in the environment. I like to focus on these sort of not alien, that's not the right word, but like the sort of like fish out of water nature of the characters being in the swamp. I usually do the swamp-based adventure because they're not characters who are from a swampy land, right? And so I like to kind of drop them into this environment that's a little, that's kind of different from what they're accustomed to. As far as like my personal experiences with swamps go, I have traveled through the Deep South a lot, including Mississippi and Louisiana. And that's real swampland. Okay. That's not this, whatever sort of like ephemeral thing you might be capturing in Hong Kong. That is like straight up swamp. Okay. And it's a very particular kind of environment. And, I think, one thing you can do is like watch films. If you're not from an area that has that kind of environment, watch lots of films or good TV shows that really capture this sort of like languid, humid, discomfort of the swamp, right? I'm thinking, a companion adventure from our very first episode of Fear of a Black Dragon, True Detective, right?
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that because it wasn't in the notes for this episode yet, but yeah.
No, but I mean, I knew I was going to talk about it here, so.
Yeah. Okay.
But, no, for sure. There are ways you can kind of like, capture that. I think reading like reading good bits of like literature, possibly maybe something by Faulkner, that where swamp imagery like plays a big part of it, I think is also a good move. But yeah, as far as like my personal experience is mostly just passing through, because I'm sure as fuck don't want to live in a swampy area. So.
Fair enough.
Although I'm from Houston, and Houston's basically a swamp that's been cemented over. So
yeah, I mean, how humid is it? Because actually, that's one thing. I think if you're from a drier latitude, when I first moved to Hong Kong, and rather the first time I played football, what you don't realize is that the humidity really saps your energy if you try and be active.
It does.
So that's why swamp stories are languid, isn't it? Because you can't move that much without exhausting yourself.
Yeah, well, that's actually a pretty good. You'll put a pin in that, because that's something I want to talk about later about like how do we mechanize the swamp, right?
Yeah, sure. That's yeah. So that's it. I think even if you've had you've experienced some elements of swamps without ever visiting one, you can take something from a different environment, but as long as it matches, you can apply it. But also, I wanted to ask you about, and since you do run a lot of swampy games, why a swamp, right? Because the whole point of having a setting is to do things there that would only work in that environment. Like, why a swamp and not the Arctic tundra? And I had a few ideas, but I wonder what's the appeal to you of the swamp, as well as the fish out of water thing?
No. I'm glad you asked. I mean, if you think about a swamp environment is really different from other environments in terms of, in a swamp, the player characters are both right in the middle of it in terms of like whatever the creatures are around, in terms of the trees, in terms of being on the water. They're right thrust in the middle of it. And yet they still often can't see what's coming, right?
Right. Yeah,
you think about like wading through hip deep water or something, right? Like you can wade through the water, you can walk through the water, you can fight in the water. You are indeed right there in the water. But because the water's murky, you can't see what lies beneath the surface, right? It's not like being deep in an ocean, right? It's not like I have a magical enchantment. I'm in the ocean and, swimming around the vast, beautiful blue sea looking, and fighting monsters. It's not like being in a forest where, okay, sure, there might be things hiding in the forest, but you still have solid ground beneath your feet. You don't have this element of walking around in a substance where there are things at your legs that can get at you, right? It's not like being in a wide open environment, certainly, in that, there are lots of things you just can't see because visibility is so low. So swamp has this really interesting portent about it, right? This very interesting sense of like being enclosed, of being in the middle of it, like just thick in the middle of it, but at the same time, like with lots of unknowns, and I love that.
Yeah. I mean, it seems such a prosaic thing to say as well, like water that you can't see through, but I really think that's such a key element that
it's so powerful.
Definitely want to, I mean, you can't force people to put their characters wading in the water, but you can certainly put some treasure or something they want to get that's only accessible by doing it. Because I mean, I think when I think of swamps, I think of things like a rogue trooper comic I read when I was a kid in 2000 AD with this one panel that's always stuck in my memory of these soldiers walking knee deep in the water. And that idea that, and it is different from the sea. Like the sea can be scary. That moment when you're swimming in the sea and you think, oh wow, there's a lot of emptiness beneath me. There could be anything down there. That's not going to happen in the swamp. But the idea that you can get very close to something or it can get close to you without you being able to see it because the range of your vision is so limited. I think that's pretty powerful stuff. And you could point that up as well. Like if you've got a ranger type character in your fantasy game, you could say, normally you'd be tracking this from, miles away, but actually you can creep up to it just a few yards away. And then just like shrinking those distances is really interesting, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if you like in Fever Swamp, if the characters are on a boat, that has its own sort of tension and horror, right? I mean, I think of like some wonderful, some not so wonderful, but movies I've seen of people on a little boat going down a river, going down a swamp, swampy river, going down a waterway, and just, all the nasty things that are in the water, the possibility of the boat leaking, what happens when we finally get off the boat, right? Like I think Fever Swamp actually does a really good job of, but the basic assumption being the characters are on a little boat. and sort of what it means to be kind of stuck on this little boat and everything that you are depending on to get you through this experience being contained to this tiny little space, what that means. I think that there's a real tension there, right?
Yeah, it's like a very fragile bit of solid ground. Because of course there's not that much, there is solid ground around, but it's not always. The swamps have this thing of something that should be hard and solid often turns out not to be, rotting logs or just muddy ground that your foot goes right through. So that canoe you're in the default Fever Swamp kind of assumption, that's solid and it's probably not going to rot anytime soon, but it just takes one crocodile to flip it over. And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. Where are we going to go next with this?
Well, I mean, you've got more experience in this field, I would say, as a GM in particular. So what's your sort of GM playlist like in a swampy scenario compared to like say an urban adventure?
Sure. Well, I think there's probably there's some performative aspects that I think you should probably pay attention to when you're GMing a swamp-based adventure. I think speaking very slowly and quietly goes a really, really long way to emphasizing the languid nature of the swamp adventure. Whereas if I were speaking in a really fast, bright tone like this, it would kind of ruin the effect, right? It would break the spell a little bit. So that's a really simple little thing you can do, right? To really, and that works for horror games too, by the way. I like to make the locals sound different. I avoid like a sort of full-on Cajun accent or whatever, right? I don't really do that. And I try to be mindful of sort of classist swamp people tropes or whatever. But I do think that one of the most effective ways you can telegraph how different a place is to have the locals be different. And this makes a lot of sense because these are people who have chosen to live in this very specific and in many ways harsh environment, right? They've chosen to make their life here. There are just going to be huge cultural differences, right? And I think one of the ways you can convey that is in the sort of performative characteristics as the GM, like how you portray those locals. I think that's a thing you can do. We've already talked about some of this already, but I think you can use elements of the natural environment to build tension, right? We talked about this idea of the murky water. I will actually play that up so that there's like a doom clock attached to it, right? So, as that clock is counting down, I'm showing something big and menacing more and more in the water, right? So maybe it's just a little splashing. Maybe they see a fin or something. Maybe something bumps up against the boat, right? Like it just gradually like building that up, right? Until the thing finally appears. That's a great thing you can do. Obviously emphasizing the discomfort of the place is a great thing to do. Like I said earlier, I'll kind of reiterate a point I was making last episode, which is I will often put it on the players to describe to me their discomfort, right? Usually through painting the scene questions, a technique I've talked about many, many times. I will also use the swamp or the hostile environment as an opportunity to explore the player character's irritation with each other, right? And you can kind of, again, I'll just refer you back to the last episode where I talked about some of those techniques. So that's kind of my approach, I think, just things like that.
Cool.
Also, I think, and I put a pin in it earlier, so maybe we should go ahead and just come back to it.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I forgot completely. Go on.
I think like custom moves and custom procedures are a really good idea for an environment like this, for a swamp environment. One of the nice things about Fever Swamp is it anticipates things that you can expect to deal with in the swamp and it mechanizes them, right? Like the diseases and what happens like if your boat is going to sink, right? Like the process of tracking that. I think that anticipating certain elements of the environment and finding ways to mechanize them gives it mechanical weight, and the mechanical weight is really important to telegraphing its importance to players, right? I don't think you want it to be so abstract. I mean, obviously you need to stay in a real particular headspace, and create a certain kind of space at the table like Tom and I have been talking about here. But giving that little bit of mechanical oomph to the proceedings also gives it just that extra little bit of substance. And I think that goes a long, long way. Consider whether there is some kind of movement penalty when trudging through swamp water, right? And then mechanize that if your game hasn't done that already. Consider how the environment affects your equipment, right? Like in terms of rusting or waterlogging or that kind of thing, and mechanize it if you need to. I'll give a little shout out to Dylan, who ran our game at Camp Nerdly. So we made getting a barrel of fresh water like something that we wanted to do, right? And so, we have our little water skins, and the way the black hack works is you have like a die size. Usually it's like a D6 or a D8 or whatever. And whenever you use it, you roll it. And then if you get a certain number, that die size gets smaller until, after the D4, it's gone, right? And that's how you know it's gone. And so we were like, well, hell, we want to get a big barrel of fresh water and keep it on the boat with us so we don't have to worry about that. And so Dylan made a quick, on the fly custom procedure for, how to manage the barrel of water, kind of using the Black Hack's die size, equipment management thing. And it was really cool. And it was a great way of taking care of that little, aspect of being in the swamp, right? That we had anticipated as a group. And so Dylan, gave it some mechanical heft. And indeed, it also made it feel really important, right? It felt important enough to, if this is important enough to have a mechanic tied to it, it's also it gives it some importance in the setting.
Yeah. Oh, and in hindsight, that's made me realize that I could have also been, actually, I don't think that was a missed opportunity, because I don't think they actually rolled any 1s or 2s on their supply dice, but Stay Frosty uses a similar system for ammo and general equipment, fuel and stuff to the Black Hack. And so every time you move from one point to another in your point crawl, or in this case, hex crawl, there's a chance that you may have to roll the fuel dice for your vehicles, that kind of stuff. And of course, what I could have done was, when that does get reduced, to not make it an issue of fuel dwindling or whatever, but rather it's some kind of inefficiency or breakdown caused by being in this environment that's hostile to the machinery that it's not really designed to operate in. And that would have been quite a good way to handle that. Actually, yeah, it didn't really come up, but I will keep that in my mental notebook for future use. Yeah.
Well, you were doing a one shot too, so I think that that changes the calculus a little bit, but for multiple sessions, I think something like that would be super handy. Well, awesome. Is there anything else we want to say about running a swamp-based adventure?
Oh, actually, there is one last thing, which is more in the realm of the abstract and la-di-da, which is talking about thematic content in a swamp. And I think the interesting thing about swamps is that they are paradoxically both full of decay and full of kind of life and fecundity. Yeah. And therefore, if you want to reinforce that sort of stuff, or if you want to reinforce it, you want to maybe have lots of, actually a scenic Dunsworth kind of setting with lots of kind of childbirth and families and so on. And of course, a decaying cursed family in one of the households, if I'm remembering that correctly, way back from episode 1. Yeah.
The Van Kauses, I think. Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. And of course, if you want to deliberately counterpoint it, then you might do something about things being clinical and robotic, but being set in the middle of the swamp as a weird contrast. But I think that's the cool central theme maybe you could look at for a swamp.
I agree 100%. I mean, something we talk about a lot, you and I, Tom, on this show, is how to capture theme, right? And how to use theme as a powerful way of conveying the setting, conveying a sense of reality, right? And I think you're exactly right. That central theme of decay combined with fecundity is something that you should think about, right? And you should explore it in the ways that Thomas suggested is really cool, either by emphasizing it, with this sort of in this sort of scenic Dunsmith way of this sort of family-based adventure, but also with the decay, the sort of moral decay that's happening, or with the strange juxtapositions. Any way you can kind of fiddle with the theme is always going to sort of make it just seem so much more sharper and so much more powerful in the players' minds. Let's go to companion adventures. Hi, listeners. I wanted to let you know about a couple of things. The first is that our Pride Month issue of Codex is now in our Patreon feed. Codex Glamour contains a number of great features, including a new skin for Monster Hearts 2, a gumshoe scenario about a vampiric David Bowie in 1970s Berlin, an original story game called Midnight at the Oasis, and 36 cultural fashion items. To get Codex Glamour, just make a $4 or higher pledge on our Patreon by June 30th. That's at patreon.com/gauntlet. The other thing I want to talk about is related to Gauntlet Hangouts. Gauntlet Hangouts is the absolute best place to play indie RPGs online. Our calendar has more than 125 sessions per month across a variety of genres and game systems. Of course, those games are really hard to get into if you don't hold one of our $7 Patreon spots, because folks who hold those spots have early access to RSVPs, and the $7 Patreon spots are always sold out. Well, I'm very excited to let you know that we will be making more of the $7 spots available on July 1st. On that day, we will open up 75 more spots, and believe me, they're going to go fast. To find out exactly when they drop that day, be sure to follow us on Twitter at GauntletRPG. Thanks. All right, it's the companion adventures. I have a couple of game things. I am going to suggest the Undercroft zine that is also produced by the Melsonian Arts Council. This was where I first heard about them. I have all the Undercrofts. It is an OSR zine. It was a big inspiration for the Gauntlet zine codex, actually, in many ways. And it has that like really nice, especially the earlier issues, has that really nice like kind of DIY zine quality to it. But the stuff's really good. And importantly, there are connections between a lot of the elements of the Undercroft and Fever Swamp, but it seems like they do indeed take place in the same universe. So that's pretty cool. And the other game thing I'm going to recommend is a kind of a semi-LARP by Jason Morningstar called Carolina Death Crawl. Carolina Death Crawl is a historical game set just after the Civil War, or maybe like right at the end of the Civil War, the American Civil War. And you play Union soldiers who are trying to get back to their southern home. And it's in a sort of swampy part of South Carolina. And because they were essentially traitors to the Confederate cause, they have like big targets on their back, right? And so they're trying to get back home. And what I love about this, and the reason why I'm recommending it as a companion adventure, is that game does a really good job of capturing a lot of these tensions we've been talking about, like this sort of environmental tensions, the sort of slow, brooding, languid menace. All those things are really shine through in this game. There's a process by which if your character dies, you become a swamp ghost and you torment the other characters. It's, in addition to being just a really good game, it does deal with a lot of those themes, which is awesome. And, part of what we're doing with this show is trying to cross the streams of role-playing game fan bases a little bit, right? So check it out. I think you guys will like it. What about films, Tom?
Okay, so I'm going to recommend 2 bad films and 1 good one. Let's start with the quite bad ones. Firstly, from 1997, starring Jennifer Lopez and who else is in it? Jon Voight, doing what I recall the late great reviewer Barry Norman described as a King Lear at one point, as in he's leering, and it's really good. And it is quite a good leer. Anyway, they're on a boat, they're in the Amazon, there's a big snake. I mean, you can put all that together. The name,
it's Anaconda.
Anaconda. Oh yeah, I forgot. I was just so lost in remembering. The weird thing is I think I've seen it twice and I can't explain why. And then the other one I'd like to talk about is Hard Target, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme. It was John Woo's, I think, the first film he directed in America. It's pretty bad. There are moments where you can sort of see that they let John Woo off the leash and he was allowed to do a nice bit of mise-en-scène, but mostly it's just Jean-Claude Van Damming his way around the swamps of, I think, Louisiana, which is sort of supposed to explain his accent, I think. I can't remember. Anyway, there's some sort of terrible swamp cliches which are worth a look, although I will give you a content warning for snake cruelty at one point. Anyway, good films. Let's talk about a good film, which is Monsters from 2010. And this is set in a sort of alternate present day where strange alien titanic beings, the monsters of the title, have landed on Earth. And they, I think in the backstory, they're sort of in different places on the planet. But the point here is that there is a photojournalist who is in Mexico and misses his bus home to America. And so does the rich daughter of some kind of multimillionaire. And basically, he's hired to help get her back home, which he wants to do by crossing through the forbidden exclusion zone, which is in kind of the northern Mexico, southern US area. And actually, I think may extend a long way down, because if you're in swamp territory, as they are in various places, that's got to be a long journey. And you want to talk about kind of serene, languid, occasionally menacing visuals and pacing. This really has it. And because there's such a sense of the unknown going through it. I think it's a really good match for Fever Swamp, which, because it's not a real-world swamp setting, is full of kind of unknowable threats. And in fact, not just threats, just sort of there's an ecosystem at work that you can't really understand, or at least you can't be aware of at the very beginning. And pretty good movie. Don't bother with the sequel. But yeah, monsters.
I have a film recommendation too. That's going to be The Apostle, starring Robert Duvall. The movie is okay, not one of my favorites, but in terms of movies that just do a good job with a swamp aesthetic and like the visuals of a swamp environment and setting, for my money, that's one of the best. Anything else you got, Tom?
Yeah, one thing. Well, I mean, okay, actually, on films, of course, we're taking as read all of the swampish Vietnam movies, right? So let's, just mention it briefly. You know what to watch. But for music, it's very easy to pick any kind of, slide guitar-based album. Most of them are by Ry Cooder or feature him on at least one track. So that's the thing to Google. But I wanted to highlight a collaboration that Ry Cooder did with Vishwamohan Bhatt in 1993. And VM Bhatt is a guy who... he actually invented his own instrument, which I cannot remember the name of right now. And it comes in two versions. One is a slightly altered, kind of Indianized slide guitar. And the other is a kind of Delta bluesized sarod, one of the traditional Indian classical instruments. And these guys met up in 1993. They recorded this album called A Meeting by the River, about an hour after they'd first met. It's got 4 tracks on it. It's 40 minutes long. And it's really nice. And it's a slightly, so you'll be able to hear that kind of slidey, shiny metal guitars Americana in there a lot, but you'll also have a lot of other interesting textures, which will be very much worth listening to and getting you into that otherworldly headspace that you need for Fever Swamp.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we can be found on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We are on G+. Just go to the community section of G+, and search for The Gauntlet. We also have a Facebook page as well. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com, where you can see all the other podcasts and cool things that we produce, and as well as get information about GauntletCon 2018, which is coming up pretty soon. And if you'd like to join Heroic Dylan on Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.